Hello and welcome to reliability. This is a concept that we're going to apply to a variety of different research methods. So, reliability refers to consistency of a measure or a study, i.e. if you carry out a test multiple times, it should achieve similar results. Now, not necessarily exact same results, but similar. A really good example of this would be something like an IQ test. If you conduct an IQ test 7 or 8 times, your IQ should come out more or less the same each time. There may be some variation, but that should be consistent. Reliability is a crucial concept in science. Findings that are unreliable are not scientific. And this links to the idea of replicability, which we'll get to later as a key feature of science. So there are two types of reliability, broadly speaking. In the same way we talked about validity in year 1, we're now talking about the difference between internal and external reliability. So the internal reliability of a study can really be assessed by looking at the tools and measures that we use in that study. So a personality test, for example, should actually measure aspects of personality. And the questions that you form in a questionnaire should try to elicit information about what they seem to suggest they should reliably. We can assess the internal reliability, and we'll look at this in more detail, by splitting questions and comparing them. And if the measures consistently show what we think they show, then that gives our test, our measure, reliability. External reliability, on the other hand, is some sort of test within a study that produces similar results. So if you're carrying out an experimental method, they should produce similar results each time. Caffeine, for example, if our hypothesis is that caffeine has an effect on memory, this should be consistent in order for it to have external reliability. We can have a look at ways of assessing this as well. So, reliability of observational techniques. We'll go through each of these research methods and look at how reliability applies to them and how we can even improve reliability. So, assessing the reliability of observations. There's two ways of doing this. One is what we call intra-observer reliability. So we record the behavior and then observe it twice. So intra means within, so it's the same person essentially observing the same material twice, and if they come up with the same conclusions, the same behavior categories, things like that, you say it has intra-observer reliability. This is not the most useful technique because it is still the same person, therefore is subject to bias. Inter-observer reliability is the one you're more familiar with. If two people observe the same phenomena and have agreement on that phenomena, on interpretation and so forth, you say their observations have inter-observer reliability. Generally, what we do is we calculate a correlation. So if their observations correlate at a coefficient of 0.80 or higher, then your observation is considered to be quite reliable. So if we take a study like Ainsworth, this had high inter-rater reliability of above this value. Just to recap, correlation coefficient is a measure of the relationship, the strength of a relationship between two variables. A high number, positive or negative, represents a strong relationship. In this case, we want a positive correlation between our observers, not a negative one. The statistical test we often use is Spearman's Rho. We're going to have a look at this in just a couple of lessons' time. So, how do we improve the reliability of observations? Well, there are some fairly obvious ways of doing this. If we have low inter-rater scores or low inter-observer coefficients, this could just be because we haven't operationalized the behavior categories appropriately. So we have two categories that are very similar, and that means two observers reasonably come to different conclusions. Pushing and hitting is always the one I use. When does a push become a hit? There's no clear boundary. So you might want to go back to your behaviour categories, redefine them, and repeat the observation. Training is another one, so that you give clear examples of types of behaviour. So in Ainsworth's study, many of the participants, or the observers, actually had watched videos of infant caregiver interaction, and this gave them a baseline for the sorts of behaviour they were expected to identify. Operationalisation, if you need to refamiliarise yourself, but I think we've done quite a lot on that recently. So, the reliability of self-report, that's observation. How do we assess and improve the reliability of self-report? Well, just to recap what self-report is, this question came up in the exam, it threw all of you, which is unfortunate, but there are 3 types of self-report that we really deal with. The first is questionnaire, second is structured interview, and then the unstructured interview. The strengths and weaknesses of each are here. There is something called a semi-structured interview, which would nestle in between here, and you know something about that. The key issue for self-report measures tend to be social desirability bias, response bias, and interviewer effects. And we're going to look at some of the issues relating to those that may cause our self-report to be unreliable. So, one of the things we can do in a self-report, tests and questionnaires for example, is test-retest reliability. This is when the test is given to the same sample twice, usually after an interval so they've forgotten what the bulk of it is. If the scores are similar, the test is reliable. We can measure this with a correlation coefficient, so it's like having 2 data sets again, and we just see if they're correlated. The stronger the correlation, the more reliable our test is, or questionnaire. The downside with the questionnaire and the test is that in a test situation, the exact same test may actually suffer from practice effects and things like this. So this is about your external reliability in your research. Assessing external reliability from interviews, we use InterInterview Reliability. I know that's a mouthful, but just like we've got inter-observer, inter-rater, we have inter-interviewer. This can be done by interviewing the interviewee twice, but keeping the interviewer the same. So the same person conducts the same interview essentially with the same interviewee, and we compare the responses. This is very common actually in the police. Police will often re-interview witnesses asking very similar questions each time, and this used to be a practice especially in the decades gone by, where the police were trying to trip up the witness to challenge their perspective. So they would keep interviewing them and see if their story stacked up. If conducted right, though, this is a way of assessing reliability of interviews. Split half reliability. We divide the test into 2 parts and compare the score. If they are similar, then there is internal reliability. So you take maybe the first half of a questionnaire, or an interview in this case, and the second part of the interview, and we try to compare the 2 parts. If the interview is about attitudes towards immigration, I choose immigration because it's a hot topic. If we're asking participants how they feel about immigration, if they are positive about immigration in the first part of the interview, we would also expect them to be positive in the second. And if they're not, maybe our interview questioning or our style is interfering with that. And equally, if we want to get someone's attitudes about global warming and recycling, you take their answers from the first part compared to the second. And if they're in favour of recycling and they're concerned about global warming, this should be reflected in both sections of the interview. Okay, how do we improve the reliability of self-report methods? Very similar to our observations. most of the issues are going to arise as a result of ambiguity in terms of the questions developed, asked, or the task we're asking them to undertake. For example, a question that asks, what are your thoughts about education? This is hugely open-ended, and you may get wildly varied results. What do you mean by thoughts about education? Your own thoughts about your own education, other people's education, your children's education, the philosophical nature of the purpose of education, facts and figures, what's happening right now. This is too big to really be clear about. But if you ask a slightly more directed question, like, do you believe that examinations are easier, are less robust than they used to be, this drills down into what you're actually asking. Reliability of experiments. So, reliability of experiments. When assessing the external reliability of experiments, really we're concerned with the method we're using to measure the dependent variable and how consistent is this. So I mentioned IQ test. If you score 100 on your first IQ test, you should score somewhere in the ballpark of 100 on your second, and your third and your fourth. If you take the IQ test 4 times and you get 4 different results, this is not a reliable measurement. I've told you before that I've taken lots and lots of IQ tests. Most of them have been consistent, but I did have a particularly low score on one of them, which obviously I writ off as an outlier, but it's one of those issues that if every time you get a different result, if every time you sit a mock exam, the first time you get an A, second time you get a D, I would question the marker and the marking. So, improving the reliability. One of the ways we do this in experiments is through standardization. Ensure that all the procedures are followed in the same way. Instructions are given by the same person, ideally, in the same manner. The best way to give instructions for an experiment often is to write them down. Everyone gets the same material. You don't have to worry about the experimenter affecting the group. Keeping this the same when you're replicating the study is particularly important. So that's reliability. We've looked at assessing the reliability of observations, questionnaires, interviews, and experiments. We've done some work on how we improve the reliability of all of these. And we've looked a little bit at the theoretical concept of reliability in itself. In class, what we're going to do with this understanding is we're going to assess the research that you've conducted so far, each study in terms of its reliability. As always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate. We're going to move on to an exam-based question now, but if you're happy with your understanding and you do not want to practice this exam-style question, you may end the video. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Right, reliability exam-style questions. These can be quite nice questions to get. So, explain how inter-observer reliability could be ensured by working as a pair. So this sort of question would normally be related to a scenario. And they've given you the key idea there, working as a pair. Obviously, there's going to be some communication occurring. So they've told you it's inter-observer reliability, you know it's an observation. All you have to do now is explain it. So the first thing is your behavior categories. Remember, this is how we improve the reliability of studies. So you work with your partner to ensure that the behavior categories are unambiguous and their interpretation is clear. Each student then, or observer, should then observe the same individual or location, but count and tally separately. So you're observing simultaneously. You may even be standing next to each other, but you are tallying your sheets separately. Alright? Their recordings then should be compared, and recordings I mean their tallies, using an appropriate statistical method, e.g. correlational analysis, specifically Spearman's rank. And if the correlation coefficient is high, this suggests that the observation has high inter-observer reliability. So that's the sort of content I'd expect you to write for a 3-marker here. Very nice, easy question to dust off. Let's look at something a bit more challenging. So take a minute just to read this. Right, so this is really talking about the reliability of his observations. He's standing there, he is recording the male and female speech and categorizing it to represent these irrational cognitions. So how could Jefferson have reduced the effects, the investigator effects caused by his presence? Well, Jefferson could have reduced investigator effects by using inter-observer reliability. A second observer co-watches behavior and tallies them independently. Jefferson can compare his score using the appropriate test. A high correlation means this. The question does not directly ask about reliability, but investigator effects clearly reduce the study's reliability. So the key you want to dust off here is you want to get Jefferson out of the area. So you ideally want their verbalizations to be recorded outside the presence of the investigator. Then you can implement all of this. So if they record it, Jefferson and a colleague can then observe or listen back to it, tally independently, measure the scores. This will increase the reliability. So that's us done for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed or at least learnt something from this presentation. Don't forget the notes are on Blend Space. Hopefully you've printed them off and have been annotating as you go. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.